Thank you so much for having Peter and I here. It's such an honor to be here. Peter and I actually met through the Foundation for Climate Restoration. And so that's where we met. And so it's always an honor and a pleasure to be in the same space as Peter again. So yeah, I guess we'll dive right into the questions now. Unless Peter, did you have anything to say first, or should I jump right in?
No, yeah, let me talk a little bit about climate restoration, and a little bit about myself. And so first of all, thank you for having me here. It's a privilege. I'm really excited to be here and hear your questions. Usually it's me asking you questions, so this will be more fun. Ashley, when I was a junior, I was at MIT and I was studying physics, so in a different field than you're in. And my climate relationship started then, and I was reading about climate, global warming, and this was 1974, 75. And it was the first time people had really read about it. Now, as a physicist, I thought for a minute and I said, well, that makes sense. If we're pouring all this CO2 into the air and CO2 absorbs heat, then it's going to warm up the planet. And that was the end of that. And back then, it's amazing how long ago this was. So we're just finishing the Apollo program, landing men on the moon, and so I was very aware, as was everybody, that we had the machinery to get CO2 out of the air, and there were submarines which got CO2 from people's breath out of the air. So I figured, as a physicist, well, the engineers know how to get the CO2 back out, and everyone, the writing said, and it made sense, that about the end of the century, we would have to do something. Now, I was 18, and 25 years in the future was a long ways into the future. I'm 67 now, so it's laughably short. But when I was in college, 25 years was infinitely far away. And I said, you know what? I'm not going to worry about that. We know how to do it. And I'm not an engineer, so I'll let the engineers do it. And I studied astrophysics, and I studied supernovae, exploding stars in a galaxy 50 million light years away. So the stuff I studied happened 50 million years ago. I knew I wasn't going to, no one was going to die if I made a mistake. And I say this because when I fast forward to 2010, which is the time I started getting serious about climate, it was 35 years later, and I had been working in poverty reduction. So I have a software business, and I do a lot of physics. I was very busy, and then for my free time, Ashley, you have a hair business, and I did volunteer advocacy in Congress. And I mean, you do a lot of that too. But the thing I could see over the decades was that the progress we were making in poverty, and we had reduced the child death rate hugely. I don't remember the exact number, but by back almost a factor of 4. From when I started in 1980, late 70s to 80 to 2010, it was down by a factor of 4. And but it was stabilizing. That is, the poverty and hunger were not getting better anymore, and it was because of the climate. So I thought back that when I was young, I knew that the scientists would take care of it. So I went back to my old friends and said, "Hey, how's it going? How's it going getting the carbon back out of the atmosphere? Because that's what we need to do." And they looked at me like I had 2 heads. I said, "We're not getting carbon out of the atmosphere. We're just trying to reduce how much we put in." And I thought that was really crazy. I said, at the time I had kids, who were also college age at that point. And I said, I'm not going to let my kids die because we're not taking carbon back out of the air to make the planet livable. And that's how climate restoration got started. I started out very resigned and very angry. And one time my daughter came home from college, as I imagine you have recently, and I realized that if I didn't do something about it, the planet was not going to be livable for her. We're not that wealthy that we could just go anywhere. And I finally figured out I had to, if no one else was going to do it, I was going to stand that for getting CO2 back to levels we can survive. And so I'm going to show a couple slides, and then we can go into some questions. And this is actually interesting because in our society, we really focus on individuals. But one of the reasons we hadn't pursued climate restoration is we've always been looked at ourselves as nations. And that phase of the history of humanity, that phase of the history of life on Earth is really complete. We're just one humanity. We're all intermarried. We think together. We watch similar TV. So it's about all of humanity. Let's see if I can there we go. And the three premises from the book are simply, we all want to restore a safe harbor climate that humans have actually survived. Now, if you think about it, when you hear about the UN goals, they say, well, let's reduce the worst aspects of climate change. So not asking that humans survive, they just say, let's not make it too much worse. And if you live in Pakistan, for example, I'm not even going to talk about how horrible it's been in Pakistan. Now, I wasn't there, so I can't say it firsthand, but I have seen reports. Second is, we also want to restore the sustainable population because we want to sustain humanity. And finally, what's amazing, and you don't hear in the news, is that we have the technology now and finance to achieve both goals. And what's needed is courageous leadership. And that's why we're here. And that's why you called me here. And I'm going to skip this. So some of you, actually probably a lot of you, since this is the climate summit, have seen this graph or something very similar. And this is CO2 from 1 million years ago, from 800,000 years ago to the present. And these are measurements, accurate measurements. And the present is right here. Actually, this is about 6 years ago. Right now, we're CO2 levels about this high. And in time, the agriculture developed right in here. So it was very stable. And then if you go back in time, 12,000 years, this is the last ice age. And so we Americans think of a mile of ice over New York City. That's the last ice age. And then about 100,000 years before that is when modern humans evolved. And then the more primitive subspecies evolved, over the last few million years before. The big thing I want you to see here is the CO2 levels. They were stable. They were stable here, and you might guess that the reason humans evolved is we had a very stable climate for about 25,000 years, and then it cooled down. And nature removed all the CO2 that we need to remove. So our CO2 level right now is here, and we need to come back down. And that's the same amount of CO2 as nature has removed. So the really good news is this is restoring the climate has been done before. It's been done before in recent geological history. We know how it was done. And there's absolutely no reason we can't or even won't restore the climate. But it takes new thinking. And that's what I think we want to talk about today. And the other thing is, here's why it needs new thinking. So look at the Paris goal. The Paris goal is way up here. So this is what everyone's going for. And when I look at this graph, I think what is the chance that humanity will survive temperatures and CO2 levels that high? It's like, it's not good. And then I'll ask you, have you ever heard an expert say that we have even a decent likelihood to survive CO2 levels that we'll have if we achieve the Paris goals of net zero by 2050? Right? You've probably never heard an expert say that we have a decent chance. And this graph shows you why they never say that. And so Ashley gave me some of her questions, and my favorite one is part of my stealing your thunder, but it is what's the role of young people? And the role of young people is to look at this and say, you old guys are crazy. Now, I'm one of the old guys. Now, I've taken the right, I don't know, drugs or courses or something, and I can sort of see the craziness. But for the most part, as we get older, we get used to the way things were. And we think that's just the way it's going to be. And so the advantage of youth is you can look at the data and say, no, we're not going to do this. We're going to bring the CO2 back down. And so it's your voices, your leadership that's required. And let's see. Okay, so that was a million years. Just again, these give you good pictures to remember. This is CO2 just over the last 12,000 years. And you can see that it was very stable. So this is, zero is, BC and AD. Moses' time, I was showing this to my synagogue, and so they liked Moses. But agriculture develops in here. Nice and stable, and here we are. And if you wonder why the price of food is going up, why harvests are crashing, well, you can see that our ecosystem, our agriculture developed with a very stable climate, and it's not stable anymore. And life is getting very difficult. And it's like, your job is to tell us that we're crazy and we're just going to restore the climate. And yeah, so I think I'll stop there, because Ashley, you'll probably ask me, well, how are we going to do that? Is it really that easy? But I'll let you ask. So let me quit my screen sharing. Oh, one more key. Let me see if I have the slide for it here. I don't have the slide, so let me do this one. But it's critical. The human population now is 10 times the stable population we had during that time when the CO2 was stable. So as we went from the Stone Age to the Bronze Age to the Iron Age, we get better technology, and we actually evolved better plants and better livestock that were better for feeding us. So our population went up very slowly, and then it skyrocketed. And the population rise matches the CO2 rise. They're almost identical. And makes sense, right? Because the more people if you have twice as many people, you'll have twice as much CO2 going into the air. It's not rocket science. And so then the question is, why did it go up? And the answer, people say, oh, because we had better technology. It's actually simpler than that. That what keeps the population stable in any species, be it oak trees or frogs, is the child survival rate. So the number of acorns that grow into oak trees depends on how good the environment is. If there's nice rain, a lot of them will. Or if it's in a forest and it's already crowded, almost none of them will grow. And that's the design. Same with frogs or salmon. And the same is true with humans, that for all of our related species, so chimps and bonobos, about 1 out of 3 babies born will survive to maturity. And that way, if the environment is good, more will. And if the environment is bad, fewer will. And then the population level matches the environmental health. Well, we developed health science, and we said, well, we don't like our children dying, of course. So let's make sure they don't die. So we have hygiene, we have immunizations, we have vitamins, and we tripled the survival rate from 1/3 to 95% now. And of course, the population skyrocketed. Now, the good news is you can go right back down at the same rate by having fewer children, 1 or 2 children. And that's what we are. If you look at the numbers, we're actually heading in that direction. India is now right about replacement rate. Mexico is below replacement rate. US is well below replacement rate. And the trend is going in the right direction. So just the same way that we can restore the climate, and we have the technology, we have the finance, we can also restore a sustainable population. And the big thing I want everyone to take away is that concept of a sustainable population. Once you think about it, you will have, you and your friends will naturally have the right number of children to keep your community stable. Okay.
Okay, awesome.
What have you got for me,
That was a lot of great material. And at the end there, you touched on stabilizing the population, and I'll come back to that, but I want to kind of backtrack first and like go through all the things that you said. So again, you were mentioning how you were young, you were in college, and you heard of this idea of, climate restoration, and there wasn't any action back then. I think most of our audience is around that youth age, where we're all coming into terms and being aware of climate change and climate restoration. You mentioned that the first step, which everyone by being here is doing, is being aware. And then you also mentioned we also have to demand change. Are there any other steps that the youth on here can do to advocate for climate restoration and climate change? And I guess kind of like a caveat to that question, again, a lot of our audience is from parts of Asia and parts of Africa. So is there anything additional that they can do to, help us in this fight for climate action? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah. So when I was young, in high school and high school, we were fighting the Vietnam War. And if you've read American history, and actually it was true in Europe as well, there was just a lot of anger about fighting the war. The youth were saying, why are you sending us into the stupid war where so many of us are dying? And it was very antagonistic. There was very much us and them. And the thing I learned from that is really it's love, it's appreciation, it's acknowledgement that changes the world. Because we were, for whatever reason, I didn't go into those demonstrations. I thought fighting for peace, that doesn't make sense to me. So I held back and did physics. But the world has changed. As I said, since the beginning of time, our world has been tribal and national. So if one tribe failed, another tribe would come in. If one nation fell, another nation came in. If one empire fell, another empire came in. And that was sort of natural. And so fighting the wars that humans have always fought is just part of our species. Well, we're now just one, we're one humanity. When we fall, we all fall, and it's the end of the story. It's a whole new chapter. And so what's needed for the youth is don't study history quite so much as people want you to. Realize that we're in a new epic for humanity, and new epic for our planet. And that epic is humanity, humanity flourishing. So, in the US, it's a little bit easier, and the reason is that the US was developed mostly by Europeans. So Europeans came in, it's like there was nothing here because we brought diseases, and the diseases killed off most of the the First Nations, the first people here. It's terrible, and that's what happened. And so it was like an open book. In Asia and Africa, the tribes and nations have been doing their fighting back and forth since the beginning of time. And it's going to take a lot of conscious thinking to say, you know what, we're all in it together now. So that's what I would have to say there is lead for one humanity. It's one humanity, one future, one climate.
Absolutely. I love this idea of everyone working together, everyone, bringing our voices together to advocate for climate action and climate restoration, because that's how the real change is done. So great point there.
Well, let me add one thing there. The thing, as a 67-year-old, as a grandfather now, the thing to keep in mind is don't make wrong the morons here. We were doing the best we could. We were doing what humanity had done since the beginning of time. It's a change. And you don't change things by opposing the old system. You change them by creating something new that supplants it. So love us, even though we brought you a bit of a horrible heritage. Okay.
No, that's a great point. I mean, that kind of tension doesn't help, our progress. It's better just, to all work together, because at the end of the day, we're all on the same team. Even though, we grew up in different ages, different circumstances, the future is still the goal for everyone. So that's definitely a great point. I'm glad you mentioned that. And just to make sure that we're on the same page, because we're talking about everyone coming together, fighting for climate action, but just to make sure everyone knows what exactly are we fighting for. Could you talk, and I'm maybe going off the questions a bit here.
Oh, that's good.
Could you talk a little bit more? Yeah, could you talk a little bit more about climate restoration and how it differs from mitigation and adaptation? Because maybe people on here are hearing about climate restoration for the first time. What stands out about climate restoration? Why is that important?
Yeah. So climate restoration means getting the CO2 back to the levels that we had for 10,000 years, where humanity was stable, our agriculture was stable, our ecosystems were stable. The mitigation, adaptation, net zero by 2050, the goal there is to stabilize at that high level I was showing you on that first slide, where no one thinks that we can survive. And the reason that goal was there is, the truth is we all grew up as children and we didn't like being blamed. And so, so what we did, this is all the scientists, they say, well, let's just stop putting CO2 out, let's stabilize it, and then we'll be good people. And what's needed now is the wisdom of youth to say, no, that's not good enough. We actually want to survive, and that requires bringing the CO2 back down. And so in my book, and here's my book, and those who haven't seen it, it's available both in electronic copy and hard copy. The audio book is coming out in a few weeks. I just copy of it, which we'll have to edit a little bit. And excited, this is my first book. I now forgot what I was going to say about that. Oh yeah. So in the book, I talk about the big four solutions, and the way nature gets that CO2 out of the air every 100,000 years is in the ocean. If you think about it, the ocean is about 3/4 of the planet, and there's lots of sun, lots of water, and so you can do a lot of photosynthesis if you have the right nutrients. And it turns out that the missing nutrient in the parts of the ocean that are not green is minute amounts of iron. And the reason is that iron doesn't dissolve well in water, so it tends to sink. And what's interesting about the ocean is, when I think of the ocean, I think of the blue, ocean around Hawaii or in the Caribbean. And the trouble with blue is that it's not green. Green is where you get photosynthesis, which is how trees grow and sequester carbon. When green plants grow in the ocean, when they die, they sink into the depths where there's no oxygen for them to rot. So they actually take the carbon with them. And that's how nature takes the CO2 down before ice ages. And then there's a second major pathway, which is what nature does over very long periods, which is limestone. And 99% of the carbon on our planet is now on the bottom of the ocean in the form of limestone coming from skeletons and shells from sea animals. And they sink to the bottom and they stay there. And the limestone is almost half CO2 by weight. And so that's how nature also sequesters enormous amounts of carbon. And there's a company in Silicon Valley called Blue Planet, which makes synthetic limestone, which sounds amazing until you think about an oyster or a clam or a mussel. It's like this little tiny animal makes the shells. It's actually not rocket science. It's good chemistry. And so they do the same chemistry that an oyster does. So it's all doable. And what's nice, when you fertilize the ocean with minute amounts of iron, and here's how minute the iron is. It's over a square meter, it's about 1/100th of a teaspoon, so just a few crumbs per year. And you say, okay, what does that mean? Well, imagine sweeping your front porch, right? If you do that, you have maybe a half a cup of dust or something, right? So it is a 10,000th of how much dust falls on your front porch. So when you do that, the green algae that grows is food for fish. And what happens is the fish stocks come back. Of course, people can have a lot more food, but the fishing industry can easily pay for adding that minute amount of iron in the correct places. So yes, so the methods are all there. And what's missing is the new thinking that we're going to restore the climate. And that's why youth are so important. Every once in a while I get a little bit angry. I think, this is crazy. Why am I, a 67-year-old, doing this? The youth should be doing it. But the youth are beginning to do it. So thank you. Yeah, go ahead.
Of course. Yeah, no, that's a great point that you made about climate restoration and like the distinction from mitigation and adaptation, the fact that we're not settling. We really want to be proactive with our climate and make sure that we are living in a healthy state instead of settling for the unhealthy state we currently have. And then you also gave some great strategies that you discussed in your book. And again, I'll come back to your book, but I wanted to tie in another concept here. Going back to when you mentioned stabilizing our population and doing some control in that aspect, can you elaborate a little bit more about that problem and how we can, approach this problem, some solutions? Tell us a little bit more about population.
Yeah. So if you talk to people, I don't know what it's like for the youth under 30. My children are now in their 30s. And so I'm sort of out of touch. My grandchildren are less than 2. But if you talk to older people are very sensitive about population and they just don't want to talk about it. And part of it is, it's crazy, but over the history of the planet, a nation will have as many children as it can have, because those become soldiers who can fight and take over new territory. And if you think about it, that's true of probably all species, but any tribe or the country that didn't do that would, until recently, until we became one humanity, any tribe or country that didn't have enough soldiers got it defeated by their neighbors that did. And that's that phase of history is over. And so we, rather than worrying about our country, we now worry about humanity as a whole and future generations. And so it takes a different thinking where we're thinking about the planet and thinking about humanity. Because people say, well, this person is pressuring them and so on. But what I've noticed is that the people who actually control the size of the future generation are young women from age 15 to 40 years old, until they're too old to have children or many children. And that's only a small part of the population for us to really empower and let them decide what the world that they want is. And rather than telling young women what to do, young women know what to do. We just have to give permission to talk about a sustainable population. I'm a physicist and I like numbers. So the number is, if the average birth rate were the same in the world, went down from today it's 2.3. If it went down by 1 to 1.3, like it is in Italy, which is relatively high for high-income countries. If the global birth rate went to 1.3, we would actually be back at a sustainable population by the end of the century. And that means that all the collapse of forests, all the collapse of the ocean, the huge pollution in cities, the traffic jams, that would all be history by the end of the century. We call that the blip, that the population went up by a factor of 10, and we only need to go down by a factor of 4 or 5. Which we can do easily by the end of the century. But it's just a matter of consciousness and really realizing that we're all in it together, as we were saying, Ashley, that when we're fighting each other, we say, I just have to survive. Once we're in it together, we can say, oh, yeah, I'll have a small family. That's the smart thing to do. A friend of mine, actually, and a niece of mine said, I should be able to have the number of kids that I want to have. Well, I said, of course you're going to have the number of kids you want to have. What other number are you going to have? But it's sort of like someone throwing a beer can out the window of a car. Like, you can throw a beer can out the window of your car, but it's not nice. It makes the planet a mess for everybody else. And you can always move out of the city. Then, after you've made a mess of the city, you can always go out into the country and build a house, but it's not good for the rest of the planet. So, so in a sense, it's easy. And again, it comes to just really loving each other, being one as a planet, and realizing that we're responsible for all of ourselves. This is fun. I'm liking questions.
Oh, okay, awesome. I'm glad you think I'm doing a great job. But I also agree with the approach of, not forcing anyone to do anything, because I'm definitely a big proponent of you make the choice of your own body. But I also think that with education, investment in resources, like investing in women, giving us adequate health care, even sex education, like all of those positive investments can also have that positive output that you're looking for, or that we should start aiming for. I'm learning in school that these big ideas of education and healthcare definitely make a bigger difference than what it may seem. So I definitely agree with that there needs to be more investment in women, because the choice is in our hands, and if we have the right resources and investments, we make the right decisions for us in the world. So I can definitely agree with you in that aspect.
Well, let me take that one step further, Ashley,
Yeah.
and that it all fits together as a whole, because there's a study I cite in the book where they discovered that indeed, economic development and education is correlated with smaller families, but in fact, most of the increase in education of young women is correlated with a smaller family. So the countries that encouraged smaller families almost instant, or actually that automatically encouraged the families to educate their girls. And my point is that you want to plan, again, this is true for everyone, the youth, the young adults listening to this. Plan on a future where everyone is educated and healthy. Like we would have it no other way. And we now know we can have any population we want, which will, because we know how to have, people are good at having the number of children they want. So plan on having small families and a clean environment. And of course, we're going to educate everybody. Why would we have a society where people aren't educated? That'd be crazy. So when you do it all together, it's really easy.
I agree with that. I think that makes a lot of sense. And I do want to, just say this one point here that just because we're talking about like education and these resources, I'm not saying that like if women do have, a lot of children that they're not having this access to resources or they're not being educated. That is not, the correlation that I'm pointing out at all. I'm pointing out that there is a correlation that with education and adequate health care and, these smaller families and having these conversations can produce the output of, a more smaller families. And, as we go through generations, smaller families can come out of those resources. So I definitely agree with what you said too, that, we're all working together. And that's the outcome we're working towards.
Yeah, well, yeah, I want people to really leave with unwilling to have it any other way, unwilling to have everyone get a good education, everyone having the best health care. And once you do that, people will have very small families until it's time to have large families again.
Exactly. And I know we're coming short on time, but I do want to run past two more questions. What other organizations and individuals do you think are really like paving the way for climate restoration, that are really paving the way for climate action and even paving the way for, population awareness and things like that? What are some companies and organizations that we should look towards that are starting to, have the right idea about approaching these large topics?
Oh, I was not looking forward to this question, so I'm glad you asked it. I was looking over my notes before this talk, and I don't know, there are practically none. I met a judge probably 3 or 4 years ago, and I love the Global Youth Leadership Center, and I'm just honored to be able to work with them. So I encourage everyone listening to start your own group. It's a shockingly new conversation. It's, in my case, it was about a year before I talked to the top climate experts, because I went to MIT, top science and engineering school. So just because of those credentials, I could talk to anyone. And I realized there was nobody talking about restoring a climate that humans could survive. There was no one, not at Harvard, not at MIT, Stanford, not at Oxford, not Cambridge. For the fluke of history, that was a new conversation. So it's still a new conversation. And really, each one of you, please start your own organization and have people promote it, because that's how things grow.
Sure, I think more than anything, this should be empowering, because if there's no one setting the example, be the example, as you're saying. And even though you may, there's, not too many people now, I'll definitely plug you, Peter. You saw that there is this problem. You saw the need for climate restoration. You didn't wait for a seat at the table. You made the table. And so I think this encourages everybody on this call to go ahead and make that table. If you heard like an idea here from our conversation tonight, that's the whole point of this, is to give you all ideas and for everyone to create their own initiatives. Because again, this is how change is created, by everyone making their own tables, inviting people to it. That's the kind of momentum that we're hoping to start with this conversation. So I definitely appreciate your answer to that tough question. Yeah. I guess now I want to give you another chance to talk about your book. And I guess more specifically, I'll say, how does your book add to this conversation, you know, that we about climate restoration, about climate action that no one is addressing yet? What are you bringing to this green table for everyone, three of us?
Mm. Yeah. So what I found is, as I said, I never planned on this, but there was no one else doing it. And I, in a seminar, in a workshop 20 years ago, I made a mission for myself, which is my mission is to leave a world that we're proud of to our children. And so with that there, I just said, well, whatever I need to do, I guess I'll do. The book has been really valuable because it gives people an excuse to talk about climate restoration. And so I've been getting more and more interviews. Um, the book really runs through the big four. It compares simply mitigating, simply stabilizing the climate to restoring the climate. And it makes it very vivid that if we stabilize the climate like the Paris goals say, we're the oceans will be pretty much empty by the end of the century. And most of our forests will be gone by the end of the century. It'll just be a very desolate planet. And the good news is there's been no objection to it. That I'm trusting everyone listening to this will end up talking about climate restoration. The implicit objection is some scientists will say, well, there's nothing in the scientific literature yet about climate restoration. Most of the methods are innovative. Well, actually, they're just imitating nature. And so, you don't have to have a peer-reviewed technology article to do that. And so they're not saying it's impossible or bad. They're just saying, oh, wait a minute, as a priest of science, this isn't in the science Bible of peer-reviewed literature. And so when you hear those objections, don't be stopped by it. They're not saying it's wrong. They're just pointing out that it's not yet in that Bible. What else about the book? Yeah, what are the questions you have about the book?
I think you answered all of my questions, and I know you went into a lot of detail at the beginning, so I just wanted to make sure if you had any other thoughts. But I think again, you talk a lot about these strategies because they exist and people just don't know about it. So I think one thing that your book brings to the table is just awareness of the possibilities that already exist. We just have to invest in scale up these technologies and strategies.
Yeah, well, more than scaling them up, because they will scale up by themselves. Just like when I get hungry, I will eat. I don't need to plan to eat. I will eat one way or another. And if you're planning to restore the climate, you will. And we are beginning to, and we will. So the job is to acknowledge, the first thing that I had to do was acknowledge that I was resigned and somewhat angry that what's wrong with those morons, wherever they were. But you've got to go. I think everyone has to go through that phase of resignation and anger and get to the other side and say, okay, we're just going to act on it. And the strongest action is to plan on having a small family so that we restore the population. One of the interesting facts in the book is when we increased the child survival rate, from 1/3 to 95%, if we had correspondingly reduced the birth rate, if we had said, oh, wait a minute, if all of our kids are surviving, let's, instead of having 6 children, let's have 2. Now we're doing that now, but this is 200 years later. If we had done that at the right time, then we would have no climate problem whatsoever. So really, the climate issue is a direct result of our being slow to reduce our birth rate again. And so that's the biggest thing that people can do is talk about a sustainable population, because you can only have a sustainable population if you restore the climate. So once you talk about a sustainable population, of course you're going to restore the climate. I checked the literature. There's been no campaign up till now for a sustainable population. And so that's an area that everyone listening can take on.